Something happened when they met you. Not the kind of thing they could name right away, not the kind of thing they would ever admit to. But something shifted inside them the moment they realized who you actually were. The moment the surface of you gave way and revealed something underneath that was too real, too present, too alive for them to remain comfortable around. They didn't run because you were too much. They ran because you were too clear. There is a fundamental difference between those two things, and most people never stop long enough to feel that distinction in their chest. Too much implies excess, implies you should have been quieter, smaller, less demanding of depth. But too clear? That is something else entirely. That means you arrived with a sense of yourself that was fully formed, a knowing of what you needed, what you refused to accept, what love was supposed to feel like when it was honest. And that clarity, that quiet, unshakable clarity, was the very thing that made them feel the ground shift beneath their feet. You never issued an ultimatum, you never made a speech, you simply existed as someone who had already decided what they deserved. And for an avoidant, that is one of the most terrifying things a person can be. Let's go somewhere most conversations about avoidant attachment never actually go. Because most of what gets said about this is surface level. He's emotionally unavailable, she's afraid of commitment, they pull away when things get close. And while those things are true, they are descriptions of behavior, they are not explanations of psychology. They are the smoke, not the fire. The fire is this: the avoidant learned, very early, that need was dangerous. Not in a metaphorical sense, in a lived, felt, cellular sense. At some point in their formation, in childhood, in early relationships, in the repeated messages their environment sent them, they came to understand that needing something from another person was a liability. That reaching towards someone and finding emptiness on the other side was not just disappointing, it was destabilizing. So they did what any adaptive human psyche does when it encounters a recurring wound. They built a system, a way of operating that protected them from ever being in that position again. The system was self-sufficiency. The system was detachment dressed up as independence. The system was an internal architecture designed to keep genuine emotional exposure at a permanent arm's length. And that system worked. For years, maybe decades, it worked. It kept them safe, it kept the world manageable, it kept intimacy at a level they could control, close enough to feel the warmth, far enough to never feel the burn. And then they met you. Here is where it gets layered, because you need to understand what happened when the avoidant encountered someone with actual standards. Not rules, not a list of requirements posted like a job description. Standards, the internal kind. The kind that come from someone who has done enough work on themselves to know the difference between love and performance. The kind that come from someone who has sat with their own loneliness long enough to choose it over the wrong company. That is not a small thing. That is an enormously powerful thing to carry into a dynamic. Because most of the relationships the avoidant had navigated before you, whether they were consciously aware of this or not, involved a degree of emotional leverage they could quietly hold. Not leverage in a cruel sense, necessarily. But there was always something they could rely on. The other person needed them more visibly. The other person was slightly more uncertain, slightly more anxious to secure the connection, slightly more willing to reshape themselves to keep the peace. That asymmetry was comfortable. It was familiar. It meant the avoidant always had a kind of invisible upper hand, not because they wanted to dominate, but because the dynamic allowed them to set the emotional temperature. They could pull back and the other person would pursue. They could grow distant and the other person would question themselves. They could withhold and the other person would work harder. With you, none of that worked. Not because you played games back, not because you strategized or withheld deliberately, but because you were simply not available to contort yourself for someone who was not showing up. Your standards were not a performance. They were a natural expression of someone who had already been through enough to know what they would and would not carry. There is a particular kind of stillness that a person with genuine standards carries. It is not coldness. It is not aloofness. It is the stillness of someone who is fully present but fully rooted. Someone who can extend warmth without losing ground. Who can open toward another person without handing them the keys to their own inner stability. The avoidant felt that stillness, and it disturbed something deep in them. Because here is the psychological mechanics of what happens when an avoidant encounters a securely grounded person. The usual tools stop working. The withdrawal that was supposed to create longing instead creates space. The emotional unavailability that was supposed to establish distance is simply matched. Not matched combatively, matched peacefully. And that peacefulness reads, to the avoidant nervous system, as something between profound attraction and profound threat. They were attracted to you. That part was real. Deeply, genuinely, undeniably real. The version of connection they glimpsed with you was not the kind they had been recycling in previous dynamics. It was something different in quality, different in texture. It felt like it could actually hold weight, like it was built from something more than mutual projection, and the intoxicating early chemistry that eventually collapses under the pressure of reality. But that is precisely what made it threatening. A shallow pool of water and a deep ocean are not the same experience when you cannot swim. The avoidant had been wading for years, comfortable in the shallows, familiar with the terrain. And then you appeared as depth itself, as someone whose emotional world had genuine volume, genuine layers, genuine stakes. And their nervous system registered that depth not as an invitation, but as a warning. The internal experience of an avoidant, when they are with someone like you, is one that most people never hear described. It tends to get reduced to a simple story. They were scared of love. They left. But the actual interior landscape is more turbulent and more contradictory than that. They wanted to stay. There were moments, quiet moments, unguarded moments, when being with you felt like exactly the right thing. When the noise in their head went still and something in them recognized that what was being offered was genuine, that is not a small thing for a person whose entire relational history has been organized around vigilance and self-protection. Those quiet moments of recognition were probably among the most powerful things they had ever felt. And that is why those moments also activated the deepest alarm. The avoidance nervous system is not in the business of distinguishing between the good kind of vulnerability and the dangerous kind. It does not have that nuance available to it, not without significant, sustained therapeutic work. When it senses exposure, it sends the signal, and the signal is always the same. Leave. Diminish. Create distance before the distance is created for you. Because at some level that the conscious mind may not even have access to, the avoidant believes that everyone who matters eventually goes. That being truly seen leads to being truly rejected. That the version of them that is deep and real and soft is not the version that gets to stay loved. So when they met you, someone whose standards implicitly communicated, I will not settle, I will not shrink, I will not pretend this is okay when it is not, that belief lit up like a signal fire. Because your standards held up a mirror, and in that mirror, the avoidant saw the gap between who they were showing up as and who someone like you would actually require them to be. They were not ready to close that gap. Understand something about the specific shape of intimidation that happens in this dynamic, because it does not look the way people expect intimidation to look. It does not look like someone shrinking away from aggression. It does not look like fear in the traditional sense. Cowering, obvious, named. It looks like disinterest. It looks like cooling off. It looks like suddenly being very busy, very unavailable, very certain that the relationship was not quite right, for reasons that keep shifting and never fully land. It looks from the outside like the avoidance simply stopped caring. But that is the architecture of the defense. The more they cared, the more necessary it became to manufacture reasons not to. Because caring, real caring, the kind that has weight and consequence, is the very thing their entire internal structure was built to prevent. And you triggered real caring. You were the kind of person that, if they allowed themselves to fully feel what was happening, would have required them to change, to soften, to show up in ways that had always felt too exposed, too risky, too close to the version of themselves they had spent a lifetime insulating from the world. The coldness was not indifference. The coldness was the maximum defense capacity of a person who was quietly overwhelmed by how much they felt. Now here is the part that is important for you to sit with. Not to excuse the behavior, because the behavior was painful and real, and it had consequences for you, but to see it clearly, because clarity is the only thing that actually releases a person from the confusion of this kind of ending. The avoidance departure, or their pulling away, or their reduction of you to something manageable in their head, all of that was not a verdict on your value. It was a verdict on their capacity. These are not the same thing. A key that requires a lock of real complexity is not a flawed key because a simpler lock could not accommodate it. The problem is not the key, and you were not the problem. You were the complexity that exceeded what they had built themselves to hold. Your standards, your refusal to perform smallness, your quiet insistence on being met with genuine presence, your unwillingness to accept half measures dressed up as love, those were not the things that drove them away because they were wrong. They drove them away because they were right. Because they pointed directly at the work the avoidant had not done and the growth they had not yet moved through. That is not your failure. That is their frontier. There is something worth naming about what it means to have standards in the genuine deep sense, because the word has been so diluted by surface-level discourse that it risks losing its actual meaning. Standards, at their deepest level, are not about performance expectations. They are not a checklist of behaviors or a catalogue of things a partner must provide. They are something far more internal than that. They are the lived expression of a person who has metabolized their own pain rather than projecting it outward. Who has done the quiet, unglamorous work of understanding themselves, their patterns, their wounds, their needs, and chosen, consciously, to build a relationship only on ground that is honest. That kind of standard is not demanding, it is discerning. And discernment terrifies the avoidant because it cannot be charmed past, it cannot be seduced past. It does not respond to breadcrumbing or hot and cold behavior, or the kind of inconsistency that keeps anxiously attached people locked in cycles of hope and disappointment. Discernment simply sees, and then it makes quiet, unambiguous decisions. For someone who has always relied on the emotional fog of a connection, the confusion, the push and pull, the interpretive space that lets them maintain distance without officially leaving, encountering discernment is like having all of the exit routes quietly, gently, without accusation or drama, removed. Think about what that actually felt like in the dynamic from their side. They could not destabilize you enough to make your standards feel negotiable. Not because you were performing strength, but because your standards were not actually negotiable. They were not theater, they were the genuine expression of someone who had already chosen themselves, and was only interested in someone capable of choosing them back with the same quality of intentionality. Every time the avoidant tested, and they tested even if neither of you fully named it as testing, you did not collapse, you did not chase, you did not perform distress or beg for their attention, or reduce your standards to try and recapture their engagement. You simply remained yourself. Steady, present, willing, but not desperate. That steadiness was the thing they could not metabolize. Because for an avoidant, the relationship blueprint they are working from requires the other person to need more, to be slightly destabilized by the avoidant's withdrawal, to pursue in the spaces where the avoidant creates distance. That pursuit, paradoxically, is what allows the avoidant to maintain both the connection and the sense of control. When someone pursues, the avoidant can remain the cooler party, the one who is less emotionally exposed, less at risk, less likely to be the one left holding the wound. With you, there was no pursuit to anchor that dynamic, not because you were playing hard to get, but because your self-respect was simply not configured to chase someone who was not meeting you, and in the absence of pursuit, the avoidant was forced to sit with something they rarely had to sit with, the genuine question of whether they were enough to hold someone worth holding. The answer they arrived at, or at least the answer their unhealed self arrived at, was no. This is not a comfortable place to be taken, and it is important that what is being said here is received in the right way. The avoidant's conclusion that they were not enough for you was not a humble, clear-eyed moment of self-awareness. It was a distortion, a familiar, well-worn distortion dressed up in the language of realism. The avoidant mind tends to operate on a binary that was shaped in early experiences of emotional inadequacy. Either the relationship requires nothing of me, and I can maintain it comfortably, or the relationship requires genuine growth, and I should remove myself before I am removed. There is rarely a middle road available to them without therapeutic intervention. There is rarely the thought, I am not yet the person this requires, and I could choose to become them. That thought requires a belief in one's own capacity for growth that many avoidants have not yet accessed. It requires a foundational security, a sense that attempting growth will not result in collapse, that the discomfort of becoming will not be the end of them. Many avoidants, particularly those who have not yet encountered sustained relational work or therapy, do not have that security available to them. So they leave, or they stay and quietly sabotage, or they reduce the relationship in their own mind, reframing you as too intense, too demanding, too serious. Because making you smaller in the story is easier than admitting that the real issue is their own undeveloped capacity for depth. Here is something that tends not to get said in the way it needs to be said. The reframing the avoidant does, the version of events where you became the problem, is one of the most psychologically sophisticated defense mechanisms available to the human mind. And it is almost entirely unconscious. They are not, in most cases, deliberately villainizing you. They are not sitting somewhere constructing a false narrative, with full knowledge that they are deceiving themselves. They genuinely arrive at a version of events where their departure makes sense, where you were the unreasonable variable, where leaving was the rational response of a person who simply was not compatible with someone. So what? So clear, so real, so unwilling to pretend. The word they might use to themselves is too much. The word they might use to other people is intense. But what is underneath both of those words? What is doing the actual psychological work in that reframing? Is the unspoken acknowledgement that being around you required something of them that they could not yet give. And because they cannot tolerate that acknowledgement directly, they invert it. They make the requirement itself the problem, rather than their inability to meet it. This is the part that tends to land on you as confusion, as self-doubt, as the disorienting experience of having lived something real, having felt genuine connection, genuine intimacy, genuine recognition, and then watching that reality get quietly revised by someone who needed the story to be different. Your clarity did not create their narrative. Their fear of your clarity did. Let's talk about what standards actually look like from the inside of a dynamic, because this is where the avoidance intimidation becomes most visible if you know what you are watching for. A person with genuine standards does not raise their voice about what they need. They do not issue repeated reminders. They do not perform disappointment as a way of communicating that something is wrong. What they do is something quieter and, to the avoidant nervous system, far more confronting. They simply live in alignment with what they know they deserve. That alignment shows up as a kind of presence, a settled quality in how they engage. They are warm, genuinely warm, but they do not pour that warmth into spaces that consistently return coldness. They lean in, but they notice when the leaning is not reciprocated, and they gently, without drama, return to center. They express what they need, clearly and without apology, and then they release the need for the other person to respond in any particular way, because their well-being is not contingent on that response. For someone who has spent years navigating relationships where emotional leverage was always the subtext, this quality is almost alien. It does not behave the way relationships are supposed to behave, according to the avoidance internal map. It does not create the familiar terrain of pursuit and withdrawal, of push and pull, of the delicious and torturous ambiguity that keeps an avoidant comfortable in their distance. It creates something worse from their perspective. It creates clarity. There is a kind of grief that belongs to you in this, and it deserves to be honored. Because what happened was not simply that someone left or pulled away or grew cold. What happened was that a person who you had extended genuine openness toward, someone you had allowed yourself to actually hope about, could not rise to meet the reality of who you were. And that specific kind of rejection cuts differently than ordinary endings. It is not the rejection of someone who saw you and did not want you. It is the rejection of someone who saw you and was overwhelmed by the wanting, and chose to protect themselves from the weight of that feeling, rather than let themselves be changed by it. There is a particular loneliness in that, the loneliness of being genuinely perceived and then not chosen, of having been the version of yourself that you worked hard to become, not performing, not angling, just present and honest and whole, and watching that version of yourself be too much for someone to hold. That loneliness is real. Let it be real. Do not rush past it or rationalize it into something more comfortable. But also understand what it tells you. What it tells you is that your standards performed their exact intended function. Think about what standards actually are, at their deepest purpose. They are not a filter designed to keep people out. They are the natural consequence of having developed a strong enough sense of self that only genuine connection actually satisfies. They are the result of having been hurt, having learned from it, having integrated that learning, and having arrived on the other side of it as someone who is simply not available to repeat the patterns that led to pain. That is not a rigid person. That is not someone with walls. That is someone with wisdom. And the avoidant, precisely because they had not yet done that work, had not yet completed that integration, encountered your wisdom and could not reflect it back. A mirror that is not polished cannot return an accurate image. It is not a flaw in the person standing before the mirror. It is a property of the mirror itself. The avoidant was an unpolished surface. Your clarity arrived and found nowhere to land. This is the moment where a very important and very uncomfortable question tends to arise. The question of whether the standards themselves are the reason this keeps happening. Whether the depth and clarity and refusal to accept less than genuine presence is not wisdom but armor. Whether the wounds that produce these standards are still quietly running the show underneath them. That is a fair question to sit with. It is worth being honest about. But here is how to know the difference. Standards that come from fear have a particular quality. They are defensive, preemptive, designed to protect against pain rather than point toward wholeness. They often have a brittle quality. They can be felt as judgment rather than knowing. They are not grounded in peace. They are stationed at the border of an anxiety. Standards that come from self-knowledge have a different quality entirely. They are not defensive. They are not punitive. They are simply the lived expression of a person who knows who they are, who has some sense of what they are building, and who can say, without resentment, without bitterness, without drama, this is not it, and that is okay. They have space in them. They leave room for imperfection, for growth, for the beautiful mess of two real people actually attempting something honest together. What they do not have room for is sustained misalignment, chronic unavailability, the particular exhaustion of being in a dynamic where connection is always just out of reach. Only you know which kind you are carrying. But if you can read that description without it landing on you as an accusation, if it reads more like recognition than critique, then the chances are high that what you have is the second kind. The avoidant did not leave because you were too much. They left because they were not enough, and they knew it. And that knowing at the level of the body, at the level of the nervous system, at the level of a psyche that has been organized around the premise that emotional exposure leads to abandonment, that knowing was unlivable. So they made a choice that their unhealed psychology made for them. Not a conscious choice, not a deliberate one, but a choice nonetheless, with real consequences and real impact on you. And you are allowed to hold them accountable for the impact, even while understanding the mechanism. Understanding why something happened does not obligate forgiveness. It does not obligate absolution. It does not obligate continued warmth towards someone who, regardless of the interior psychology driving them, caused real pain. What understanding does is give you back the narrative. It takes the question, what did I do wrong, and replaces it with the more accurate question, what was I showing up as that exceeded their capacity? Because that is the actual story. You showed up as someone with interior depth, genuine self-knowledge, and an unwillingness to shrink. And they encountered that and could not meet it. Not would not, though perhaps a part of them chose their comfort over their growth, but could not in the way that someone without the tools for a task genuinely cannot complete it regardless of desire. There is something worth considering about the specific texture of what the avoidant lost in walking away from you, or walking through the motions of the relationship while keeping themselves emotionally barricaded, or however the particular shape of this dynamic played out in your situation. What they lost was contact with their own depth, because that is what happens when a person with genuine standards shows up in someone's life. They do not just offer connection. They offer a kind of reflection, a quality of attention that, if the other person can receive it, has the potential to introduce them to parts of themselves they have kept very carefully at a distance. The avoidant, in their best moments with you, in those unguarded spaces where the defense relaxed and something real moved between you, was touching a version of themselves that they rarely got access to. The version that was capable of depth, of being genuinely met, of feeling known rather than merely perceived. And they retreated from it. They retreated from it because the version of themselves that could exist in that kind of contact required the dismantling of a survival structure they had been building for most of their life. And that is an enormous ask of an unhealed psyche. It is not an ask that comes with obvious logic or obvious motivation, even when the person in front of you is clearly extraordinary. Sometimes, and this is one of the more painful truths about attachment psychology, the extraordinary person is precisely the wrong catalyst for change, because they represent too much, too fast, too much at stake, too much risk of loss. The avoidant needed to change, but they did not need you specifically to catalyze that change, because the presence of someone like you activated the full intensity of both the longing and the fear, and that intensity, without adequate internal resources to metabolize it, produced exactly the exit that the fear had always promised was necessary. That is not a comfortable thing to receive. The idea that you're being wonderful was part of why this did not work. But it is closer to the truth than the alternative. The version of this story where you were the problem, where you should have been less, where toning down your standards would have produced a different outcome. It would not have. It would have produced the same outcome through a longer, more painful path. Because an avoidant who is not ready to grow will find a way to retreat regardless. The person with lower standards simply gives them more room to delay the inevitable, more interpretive space to maintain the comfortable distance, more of the dynamic they are familiar with. The relationship lasts longer. The eventual pain lands harder. Your standards did not destroy this. Your standards simply made the incompatibility visible faster. They accelerated what was always going to be the conclusion of a dynamic between someone ready for depth and someone not yet capable of it. And there is mercy in that speed, even when the speed does not feel merciful. The version of love you are looking for, the version that your standards are pointed toward, the vision of relationship that has enough space in it for two fully realized people to actually exist in truth with each other, that version is not too rare to find. It is not an impossible standard. It is not the product of a wound dressed up as an ideal. It is the natural destination of someone who has done the work. The Avoidant was a detour that may have been intense and real and full of genuine moments. But a detour nonetheless, not the path, not the direction. A person who appeared in your life at an intersection between their fear and your growth, and who, when faced with the reality of what genuine connection would require of them, chose the route they had always known. You are not on that route. You never were. What tends to happen after a dynamic like this, after the confusion has settled and the grief has moved through, at least partially, is a very quiet, very private moment of reckoning. A moment where the person who was left, or almost left, or held at emotional arm's length by someone who claimed to want them, sits with what they actually learnt about themselves in the process. And what tends to emerge in that moment is something important, something worth holding carefully. They learn that their standards held, that even in the presence of genuine attraction, even in the presence of real longing for the connection to work, even in the moments where everything in them wanted to bend toward this person and make it easier and smooth over the cracks, the standards held. The deep knowing of what they deserved did not collapse. The self-respect that had been built over years of hard experience did not negotiate itself away for the possibility of someone who was not offering them an honest exchange. That is not a small thing. That is evidence of a self that is actually stable, a self that is not contingent on external validation to maintain its shape. The Avoidant was intimidated by that stability, by the groundedness of someone who did not need their approval to feel whole, by the confronting reality of a person who wanted them but did not need them, and who knew the difference between those two things well enough to live inside that distinction without collapsing into pursuit. That distinction, wanting without needing, choosing without depending, is one of the most emotionally sophisticated places a person can operate from. And it is rare. It is genuinely rare, not because most people are incapable of arriving there, but because most people have not yet been through what you have been through, or have been through it but have not integrated it, or have integrated parts of it but still feel the pull of the old patterns underneath. You have been through it. That much is evident in the very nature of this dynamic. People who have not done that work do not generate the kind of intimidation that you generated. They do not create the particular activation that occurs when an Avoidant encounters someone who truly cannot be leveraged, controlled, or reduced by the usual mechanisms of emotional unavailability. They feel the presence of someone who has arrived at themselves, and that arrival is magnetic and terrifying in equal measure. The magnetic part is what drew them in. The terrifying part is what drove them out. And both of those things are entirely about them. The magnetism was not manufactured by you. You did not seduce them into a situation they were not ready for through cunning or strategy. You simply existed as yourself, fully, and that fullness created gravity. That is not your fault. That is the natural consequence of being a person with depth in a world full of surfaces. The terror was not created by you either. It was not triggered by anything you did incorrectly, anything you failed to soften, any way you could have packaged your depth more palatably. The terror was a pre-existing condition, a fear that arrived in this dynamic the way a specific pressure will always expose a pre-existing fracture. The fracture was not caused by the pressure. The pressure only revealed what was already there, waiting. There is a reason this script was needed. Not the script itself, but the kind of understanding it is trying to name. Because most of what gets said about this dynamic either goes too hard on the Avoidant, turns them into a villain, strips out the complexity, makes a caricature of what is genuinely a painful psychological structure, or goes too easy on them, excuses the behavior in the name of compassion, subtly suggests that the person who was hurt should be more patient, more understanding, more willing to wait for someone to grow into readiness. Neither of those framings serves you. The truth is that the Avoidant is a full human being in a pattern they did not entirely choose, shaped by experiences that produced a relational architecture that causes harm. That is worth understanding. It does not make the harm acceptable. It makes it comprehensible. And comprehensibility is what allows you to stop making the pain personal, to stop taking the departure as a statement about your worth, while also refusing to remain available to someone who keeps choosing their comfort over the growth that your presence was quietly demanding of them. Your standards were not the problem. Your standards were the standard. They were the marker, the honest, clear, unflinching marker of the level at which you're now operating. And the avoidant could not match that level. Not in this season, not with the tools they currently have, not with the courage they have not yet summoned. That is not a permanent condition for them. People grow. Avoidants heal. Given the right circumstances, usually prolonged therapeutic work, significant life disruption, or the rare combination of genuine motivation and skilled support, the avoidant architecture can soften. The internal premise that vulnerability leads to abandonment can be revised. The capacity for genuine intimacy can develop in someone who spent decades insulating themselves from it. But that is their journey. And it does not require your presence. It does not require your patience. It does not require you to remain in proximity to someone who, regardless of their potential, is currently not showing up at the level your life requires. You are not responsible for their development. You are not placed in their path as a catalyst for their awakening. You are a full person with a full life that deserves a full presence beside it. The intimidation they felt was real. The running was real. The impact was real. And so is this. You came through it with your standards intact, with the knowing of what you deserve still burning, quiet and steady, somewhere beneath the grief and the confusion and the particular exhaustion of loving someone who is using all of their energy to stay just beyond reach. That knowing is not a wound. It is the most important thing you have. It is the thing that the next person, the person who is actually ready, the person who has done enough of their own work to not be destroyed by the presence of yours, will be grateful for every single day they get to build something real beside you. The avoidant ran, and in running, they handed you back to yourself. That is the thing that tends to take the longest to arrive at. The understanding that their departure, however painful the shape of it, was not a loss of something that was working. It was the release of something that was never going to work, however much the early intensity suggested otherwise. The intensity was real. The incompatibility was also real. Both things can be true, and in the territory where both things are true, the only honest direction is forward. Not toward them, not in the hope that once they heal they will return and the timing will finally align, not in the quiet holding of breath that so often follows the end of something that felt significant. Forward. Toward the person you are continuing to become. Toward the kind of connection that does not require you to second-guess your own depth. Toward a dynamic where your clarity is not a threat to be managed, but a quality to be met, with equal clarity, equal presence, equal willingness to be fully in the thing without a constant low-level readiness to leave. That is what your standards have always been pointing toward. Trust them.